Hello everyone and welcome to video tutorial 20. You should now know all about reproduction in plants and you should be able to pause the video and answer the questions. So question 1 is where are the male and female gametes produced, and question 2 is what is fertilization. So try to do that before I go over the answers. So the answers are the male gamete is produced in B, the anther, because the male gamete is pollen. And the female gamete is produced by the ovaries, and your female gamete is your ovules, so it would be produced by C, the ovary. So female gametes are produced by C, the ovary, and male gametes are produced by B, the anther. And fertilization is the fusion of two haploid nuclei cells to create a diploid zygote which divides to form an embryo. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If you didn't or you struggled, then you need to go back and watch the videos again. Today we're going to be moving on to variation and inheritance, which is key area 4. If you want the worksheets to go with the video, remember to pause the video and go to 2 multicellular for variation and inheritance, 2 consumables and activities. The PowerPoint is found in 1 PowerPoint and is called 4.1 Variation Discrete versus Continuous. Our learning intention for today is to state what a species is, identify the difference between discrete and continuous variation, and state that most features of an individual phenotype are polygenic and show continuous variation. To be successful, you will be able to write out the definition of a species. You'll be able to identify whether characteristics show discrete variation or continuous variation. You'll be able to explain why a characteristic is discrete or continuous. You'll be able to describe how to analyze discrete or continuous variation, and you'll be able to state that discrete is single gene inheritance, whereas continuous is polygenic. You should have looked at what a species was in 3rd year, so can you remember the definition of a species and try to pause the video and write it down. So, are the horse and the donkey the same species, and if they are or aren't, how can they produce this thing called a mule? So a species is a group of genetically similar organisms that are capable of interbreeding to produce fertile offspring. So when you bred the horse and the donkey, which are 2 separate species, you got a mule. The mule is infertile, so it will not be able to have offspring. So that is the difference between a species and not a species. So a species is a group of genetically similar organisms capable of interbreeding to produce fertile offspring. Well done if you managed to get that definition correct. If not, make sure that you write it over and over and learn it. So why are we not all the same if we are the same species? This is because variation exists between members of the same species. What does variation mean? As humans, we are all different. We have different face shapes, eye colour, skin colour, hair colour, body shapes, etc. So we're different from each other. We're not identical. So how does this variation happen? It happens because our genes come from 2 different parents. And what is the advantage of having this variation? This variation allows us to evolve to different environments. Some characteristics are better than others in different conditions. So variation is the difference which can occur between individuals of the same species, and combining genes from 2 parents contributes to variation within a species. There are 2 types of variation that you need to know and learn, which are discrete variation and continuous variation. So let's go over discrete variation first in more detail. Discrete variation is where characteristic measurements can be divided up into 2 or more distinct groups, so things that can be put in a category. This variation is caused by single gene inheritance of characteristics, meaning that a single gene controls the characteristic. This variation is always presented and analysed as a bar graph because you've got your discrete categories. And a top tip, if you can answer yes or no to it, then it's discrete variation and you cannot measure it. So for example, you have fingerprints or discrete variation, earlobe attachments, tongue rolling ability, and blood groups. So you either have it or you don't have it. There's not an in-between value. You need to learn the definition of discrete variation and you need to know all of this slide, so make sure that you learn all of this like part of the video. What is single gene inheritance? Single meaning 1. So it is where a characteristic is controlled by 1 gene. So for example, coat colour. Again, you need to know this, so make sure you note it down and you learn it before you move on. Now in class we'd usually take a survey of the different types of discrete variation, so we'd see who could roll their tongue and who can't roll their tongue, who had different blood groups, who had attached earlobes, who doesn't have attached earlobes, and so forth. And then we would use this data, or you get given data to create a bar chart with. So when you're doing a bar chart, remember always to label the axes. So you want to label your x-axis and your y-axis. And you always want your scale to start with 0 and it must go up evenly. The bars must be evenly spaced, and because it is a bar graph, you want to leave an even gap between the bars. Do not shade in your bar chart at all ever, because you might go over the top line. And if you go over the top line just a little bit, then you will lose your mark, like I just did. So always draw your graph in pencil, just in case you make a mistake and you need to rub it out. So there is in the consumables numbers which you can use on blood groups that you could use to draw a graph. So if you want to do that, you can. The next variation that you need to know the definition of is continuous variation. So continuous variation is where there is a range of values between a minimum and a maximum. This variation is caused by polygenic inheritance, so poly meaning more than one gene, and this variation is presented and analysed using either a line graph or a histogram. So for example, continuous variation would be height, weight, etc. So for example, if you had height, most people would fit in the middle and it would form a nice little bell curve, and there would be very little people that are really small and have dwarf height, and there would be very little people that had gigantism and were really tall. So this is what continuous variation is always like. If you can measure it, then it's going to be continuous variation. So for example, if you can measure it with a ruler or a stopwatch or a meter stick, then it's continuous variation. So make sure you learn this before you move on. So what exactly is polygenic inheritance? So remember I said poly meaning more than one. So when a characteristic is controlled by many genes, it is polygenic inheritance. And most of our features and most features of an individual's phenotype are polygenic and show continuous variation. And you need to know them 2 bullet points, okay, because they come up a lot. So learn it before you move on. So again, in the consumables, you will be able to find data to draw a histogram and a line graph for height. So a histogram is exactly the same as a bar graph, except for the bars come closer together, as you can see here. This is a histogram. And also it is a range, so 130 to 134, 135 to 139, and so forth. So as you see, there is no gap between these bars, but they're still even bars, and we still have our y-axis label and our x-axis label. Okay, and you'd want to put obviously a scale on your y-axis. For a line graph, you all know how to do line graphs. So there is always 2 numbers, so you'd have a number on your y-axis and you'd have a number on your x-axis, and then you'd plot your line graph. As you can see, both of them go from a really small amount and then go up to the top and then come down, which is your bell-shaped curve. So we've got less people that have that height, and then we've got more people in the middle that have that height, and then we've got less people at the end, like I already explained. So if you're doing continuous variation, make sure you put it in a line graph or a histogram. From what has been said, you should be able to pause the video and sort the following statements into whether they are continuous or discrete variation. So hand span in humans, coat colour in guinea pig, seed shape in garden pea plants, number of fruits on an apple tree, colour of grain in maize plants, length of petals in buttercup flowers, eye colour in fruit flies, and diameter of shells in limpets. Remember, if you can measure it, it will be continuous, which is a great hint for you all. Okay, so pause it and try to do that before I go over the answers. So the answers are: coat colour in guinea pigs is discrete because it either has one coat colour or another coat colour. Seed shape in garden pea plants is discrete. Colour of grain maize in maize plants is discrete, and eye colour in fruit flies is discrete. So all of them you can say yes or no to, or you can put them in a group. Continuous variation would be your hand span in humans because you can measure it with a ruler, your number of fruits on an apple tree because you can count it, your length of petals in a buttercup flower because you can measure it with a ruler, and a diameter of shells and limpets, again you can measure it with a ruler. So the discrete ones are yes and no, the continuous ones you can measure. Okay, well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, watch the video again. We've now come to the end of this video, so you should be able to give examples of discrete variation. You should be able to give examples of continuous variation. You can explain what each of these is, and you know the result of genes that have been inherited from both parents. You know that continuous variation characteristics are polygenic and they are controlled by many genes, and discrete variation is single gene inheritance and it's controlled by one gene. So well done if you managed to confidently get that all correct. If you didn't, then you need to watch the video again. So that is the end of the video tutorial. Woohoo! Thank you for listening.